Hi, everybody. I am so sorry I had to cancel class at the last minute, but my 6-year-old got stomach flu, so we've been up all night long, and I'm just waiting for my other son to get it. I wanted to make a sort of video lecture for you so that you could start thinking about connecting the concepts from chapter 2 to some of the hip hop history we've been talking about. There is a homework element. Some of you have turned it in, but it's a little writing component. You'll see it on the assignments page on Moodle that deals with connecting the functions of performance to some of the content that you've been watching and considering and things like that. So this video is just an overview of chapter 2, sort of explaining some of the concepts that are somewhat difficult to sort of understand because they're a little bit gray. So I'm going to try to make it clearer for you so you know where we're going. So in chapter 2, a large part of understanding performance is to understand what it means to perform. And the book breaks down the idea of to perform into categories, including being, doing, showing doing, and explaining showing doing. So essentially what that means is if we break down, we look at the first word, being. Being is literally the act of existence. So as soon as you are a embryo inside of the womb, you are existing. You are here in this world. You are active or static. You can be linear or circular. You are always expanding and contracting. You are material or spiritual. In essence, what that means is you take a deep breath, your physical breath, right? The act of breathing, the act of living is being, okay? So when something is being, right, something is existing, it's alive, right, in our world, there's also the term doing. Doing is literally activity or behavior. It's action. For example, I will never walk into class the exact same way. Even if I walk into class tomorrow, it'll be a little bit different than how I walk into the class on Monday, right? I'm doing an actual activity, but when you do something, it's always in flux. When you do things, they always have the ability to change. So being is simply existing, right? It's simply existing. You are alive and you have the ability to interact in the space. When you do something, when you're doing, we're talking about the activity or the behavior, the action, right? That's happening. So now we take it a step further, and when we think about the idea to perform, we can consider something called showing doing, okay? So showing doing is also action, all right? But it is pointing to or underlining or displaying what you are doing. An example might be, we did our graffiti day, right? And we started in class and we talked about the difference between a tag and a throw up. And on the board, I wrote a little bit of an example about a tag, which is just linear with maybe a couple arrows. It's in, it's out, it's done. And then we talked about a throw up that deals with bubble letters or block letters and is a little bit more defined in terms of its style. When I was explaining the difference between a tag and a throw up, I was showing doing. Okay, I was underlying or pointing to, displaying how something is done, all right? And we took that a step further then by actually going to spray paint graffiti. So when you're being, you exist. When you're doing, we're talking about an action or an activity or a behavior. And when you're showing doing, you are underlining or pointing to an action. Okay? So then there's this concept of explaining showing doing. And explaining showing doing is in essence the study of performance. That is what this entire textbook is telling you about. And this is literally what the entire semester is about. We are explaining showing doing, meaning after we had our graffiti day and I showed you how to do something, we have taken history, we've taken our opinions, we've talked about different things in class to find connections, and then we've been able to comprehend how graffiti and ultimately how hip-hop is placed in the world as performance. Explaining, showing, doing looks back on the activity of learning something or underlining something or pointing to something, and it looks at it deeply. Okay? So in essence, this is what we're doing in the semester. Okay? So performances are really important, and hip-hop is really important for the same thing I keep telling you over and over, is that performances mark your identity. Yeah? They help you bend time or reshape or even like adorn your body. It helps you tell stories. We talked about how buru drumming is like a language where people pass information from one generation to another. Performances are important that way, yeah? But most performances, or all performances in some contexts, require rehearsal, right, or training. We can think about an aesthetic performance, music, theater, and dance. So we understand that graffiti, you need to rehearse and practice. We understand that buru drumming, you need to rehearse and learn and practice. We talked about dub, you need to mess around with the turntables, with the technology in order to splice and cut the beats, right? So in aesthetic performance, we understand that there's rehearsal and training, but you know what, in everyday life, there's also the need for rehearsal and training. If you think about a little baby, right? When a little baby comes into the world, they have innate reactions and relationships with the people in the space around them, but they have to learn how to do things like eat, care for themselves on their own, crawl, walk, all of these things. These things take rehearsal and training. So in the same way that an aesthetic performance requires this rigor or this rehearsal and training, everyday performances or actions, right, require this as well. All right. Performances in all contexts, so in art, in ritual, in regular ordinary life, are what we call restored behaviors, twice behaved behaviors. They're performed actions that people train for and rehearse, okay? So restored behaviors and twice behaved behaviors, these are keywords that we're going to kind of come back to as we go through the course, okay? So another point to sort of tack on to that is the, how do I explain, the everydayness of everyday life. So the ordinary circumstance of everyday life is precisely its familiarity. So it's being built from bits of behavior that are shaped in order to suit specific circumstances. So in that way, we can look at how our lives, how we get ready for school, how we deal with the situations around us are actually performances. So there are some actions in our life that sort of appear to be once behaved. And I think in your book they give, let me see, I have some notes. Oh yeah, they talk about Alan Kaprow's performance art installations called Happenings. And Happenings is sort of an event where an audience would either be confronted with an interesting artistic situation or they would go to see one. And they'd be anything from ordinary actions put into some sort of structure to Alan would build these how do I describe them? These big structures that people had to interact with. And it would appear from an audience perspective that these performances were once behaved, meaning they kind of happened spontaneously. However, the spontaneousness of the action is actually really rehearsed. Okay, so what that means is that no performance is truly once behaved because it's built on bits and pieces of both knowledge, but also of things that we rehearse in order to make up what other people see and what other people interact with. So every performance is unique, okay? These fixed bits of behavior that we know from life or from training, right, or whatever it is we do get recombined into just endless variations, okay? No event can exactly copy another event. So even in the digital world, right? So let's think about, okay, when we use social media, right? Let's say we throw up a photo on Instagram, all right? The original photo is taken and it appears on Instagram. However, when someone shares that photo, even though the image remains the same, it is different for a few reasons. One, because it's being applied to a context that isn't the original time that the picture was taken. Another reason is that when you start to share low resolution files like JPEGs, the actual digital image starts to deteriorate every time you share it. So in those ways, the event or the action or the performance, right, all of these things go hand in hand, they're never, ever, ever the same, okay? Sort of easy way to think about that is let's say you go to the premiere of a big movie that comes out. That is very different than watching that movie on a DVD in your home. Even though it's the same movie, it's not the same event, right? It has changed based on the context, the sharing, the time and space and place, okay? Let's see. Hopefully that stuff makes sense. It's a little bit tricky, but essentially the book talks about how there are sort of 8 kinds of performance, all right? And I think in order, let's see, I have them in order somewhere on my desktop here. So they're listing the 8 kind of performances. The order that it says in the book is 1, in everyday life. So in everyday life would mean it's just how you live, right? So you're cooking, you're socializing, you're working, you're, whatever else you're doing, your everyday life. 2 is in the arts, meaning aesthetic arts, music, theater, and dance. The 3rd is in sports and other popular entertainment, so football games, soccer games, field hockey games, lacrosse games, softball games, volleyball games, all of those things. The 4th is in business. The 5th in technology. 6 in sex. 7 in ritual and both sacred and secular ritual. And 8 in play. And this is my cat. I have 2 cats. This is Winona, named for Lake Winona. So these 8 kinds of performances sort of show us that in context of our class and also how we address hip hop, there's a lot of different actions and behaviors that we consider performance. It is not necessarily music, theater, and dance. I cannot hammer that home enough times, right? We're thinking about everything, the actions, behaviors, interactions, relationships as performances. So what's interesting about these kinds of performances too is that the categories of them actually overlap, right? So a great example is if you think about Olympic sports. So gymnastics, figure skating, and diving all have some element of artistry and competition that are slightly similar. However, they're drastically different sporting events, okay? So you can see that even though different performances have unique characteristics, they do share some characteristics with others. And in that way, we need to be sensitive to the idea of blending our opinions and our research based on performance studies. Okay? So deciding what is art or artful or aesthetic performance, right, depends on a lot of things, right? Because we're talking about, while we're talking about performances in terms of a broad spectrum, right? A performance can be almost anything. One of the things that comes up frequently and that we're also dealing with is the term art, right? Because performance usually you consider to be art, aesthetic arts, music, theater, dance, yeah? But what is art really depends on context, historical circumstances, how it's used, what culture is thinking about it at the time and place. A really great example, and I think they talk about it in the book, is jazz music, right? So when jazz was first started, nobody thought it was artful, right? Nobody would consider it art. A lot of people considered it just noise. It wasn't considered a genre necessarily of music. But as the social and cultural sentiment about jazz music changed, it became known as art. And now we see that there's many subgenres of jazz music. It was deemed art based on how society decided it was or interacted with it, okay? So differences are based on the function, right? The circumstances of events inside of a society, right? They can, the differences are also based on the venue, right? The behavior expected by the performers. Maybe it's a football game we're considering, right? It could be the behavior expected by the players there, right? And even by the spectators, the audience. So then we can start to break it down and go back to this concept of restoration of behavior, right? And also twice behaved behavior. So the restoration of behavior deals with the habits, rituals, and routines of life. And restored behavior is living behavior, right? But it's treated in the same way that a film director treats a film strip, right? So the strips of behavior can be arranged and reconstructed, right? To create new things. Hi, Fim, how you doing? I'm talking to my class on here. How you doing? Can I finish this up?
Well, can I take a drink?
You can.
Just call down to me when I can take a drink.
You can take a drink right now. Okay, you're doing a good job.
Call down to me when I can take a drink.
Okay, I will. So, restored behavior, if we consider it like bits of information that can be reconstructed or rearranged, all these little behaviors and actions stand alone from one another. They're almost like tarot cards, right? Where alone they mean one thing, but when you put them together with others, they create new meaning. Yeah? That's what restored behavior is. You can think of it, I think maybe that tarot card analogy is really good for you to consider, right? Restored behavior is living behavior, right? It's a behavior here. But we treat it in the way a film director cuts up film strip. So, or how we read tarot. One card means something independently from all the others in the deck, but when you rearrange them together, they create a new story and new actions, okay? So sometimes the source of a behavior, right, might not be known, right? Or in the context of everyday life, it could even get lost or ignored or contradicted, right? All of these things create meaning and allow us to sort of study and look at different experiences in new ways, all right? So restored behavior is, it's like a key process in every kind of performance, in everyday life and ritual. I think they give some examples in the book in like shamanistic healing. It's restored behavior is key in play. It's key in the aesthetic arts, right? So if we sort of come full circle and we talk back about the very first idea that we are being, right? We are just existing, we are living. And then we are doing, right? We are completing actions. But in order to show doing, right, and then explain it, we have to use bits of behaviors or actions, and we have to reconstruct them or apply them in different ways so that we can make sense of the world. Yeah? A really great example of restored behavior is thinking about a wedding ceremony. So most of us know what it means to be married in terms of the American context of marriage. And we go through certain rituals and processes to get married, right? So sort of the standard format is that the couple being married has a wedding event, and they practice walking down the aisle, they practice exchanging vows, they say their vows, and then they're declared married, and then they can kiss, right? That is something, that's a ritual, that's a behavior, that's a performance that we sort of know. Well, doing all of those things are restored behaviors, right? Because we have to learn them. And we also use snippets of what we know from our everyday life in order to reenact that behavior and also to apply it to our own wedding day. Okay, so someday if you get married, you know a lot about weddings as it is, but you have to rearrange that information in order to apply it to your own wedding. That's called restoration of behavior. Okay. So, let's see, what else? Oh, I think a big idea in chapter 2 is the idea of is and as performance, okay? So something is a performance if the world says it is, right? So something is a performance when historical and social context and convention says it is. We use something in that way, right? Tradition says this is a performance, right? But you can't determine what a performance is without referring to specific cultural circumstances, right? So, we know that going to the symphony, a symphony is a performance, right? And it is a performance because our culture, the people who live with us and our history tells us that going to sit down and listen to musicians, that is a performance, right? When we talk about as performance, we open the door or stretch the idea of what can be considered or a performance. So as performance means really any action or behavior can be studied, right? It can be studied. We can apply our own perspectives. We can look at an action or a behavior in terms of something else, right? We've been looking at the history of Jamaican dub music, right? In terms of its effect on American hip hop, right? We are looking at Jamaican history as a performance that influences what we know today as hip hop, yeah? So essentially, performance is an aesthetic event or a sporting game or something that culture tells us this is a performance. As performance means we open the floodgates and literally can consider anything in the room around you, any of the people that you know in your life, any of those actions, you can study them, you can think about them in terms of a performance. That's as performance. It's wide open. Okay. So some performances do two qualities. They can make belief or they can make believe. So performances of make belief create the very social realities they enact. Okay, so what that means, well, let me get to one more point. And make-believe performances maintain a clearly marked boundary between the world of performance and everyday reality. Okay, so make-belief means that make-belief is like a crooked politician. Okay? A crooked politician stands up behind a podium and tells his audience something that he or she wants them to believe is the truth. Okay? Whether it is or it's not. Okay? Whether what they are truly saying is untrue or true, they are projecting this information on their audience and getting the people who are listening to them believe in what they're saying. That's called make belief. Okay? The politician thing is a excellent example. We all know that a lot of politicians, and we're in it right now, often say things they want the community hear so that they'll get votes, but they're not necessarily being truthful. So when they're up on the podium, they are making belief. That is different than make believe. Make believe is like a little girl dressing up as a princess and having a tea party. She's pretending, right? She's pretending. There's a clear boundary between that little girl as herself and that little girl as a princess, okay? When a politician is making belief, there is no clear boundary, right? It's shady. You aren't clear on what is true, right, and what is not true, right? Here. This is my cat, Lego. Both girls. So the idea of make belief, right, that little shady business, is very pertinent in our discussion of hip hop, because we know in history that gang leaders and politicians have engaged in unclear boundaries. We're not sure what's true and what's not in order to push forward their political agenda. We talked about Edward Seaga, right? And his sort of duality there. It's like, well, he's like plucking homegrown artists out of Kingston, yet he goes in and plows down the Rastafarian community and puts up a big housing complex, right? That's make-belief, right? But make-believe is also really important in the context of hip-hop, because as hip-hop has grown, right, and we look at commercial hip-hop, many of the commercial hip-hop artists make believe. They pretend to be thug. They pretend to be hood. They pretend to be skanky, whatever it is, right? They do this in order to make money. So we will be considering hip-hop in that context throughout history, okay? So there are functions of performance, okay? We talked about, we're talking about how all of this kind of wraps up, and now we have functions of performance. Oh, Lego, jeez and crow. Okay, so the functions of performance are to entertain, to create beauty, to mark or change identity, to make or foster community, to heal, to teach or persuade, and to deal with both the sacred and demonic in ways of ritual and spirituality, okay? And all of these different functions, right, these are different ways that a performance can affect a community or incite change, right? And the functions of performance are all interlocking, right? They're all interlocking. It's really similar to that experience with the Olympics, right, where I talked about like gymnastics and diving and figure skating all overlap. Well, the functions of performance also overlap, okay? So consider, for example, a football game. In a football game, there are several functions working together. A football game entertains a crowd, right? An audience comes. There is pomp and circumstance around the players, the idea, there's camaraderie, there is the spirit of the audience who wants the teams to win, right? It also fosters community, a football game. It fosters community within the audience. So when we go to football games or any sporting event at PSU, we want our team to win. Yeah, we want our team to win. It's bringing us together. But it also brings together the players as a community, right? Any person who plays sports or is involved in an organization or a club or a group of friends, you know that you come together and it really helps you identify. You feel like you have a community. It raises you up, yeah? If we go back to the sporting event, it also, right, that football game also is there to teach or persuade, right? So the players who are playing on that team are learning. They're learning how to be better players in order to win. So there are many functions to each individual performance, and you can find a way to connect many different functions to many different performances, whether they are aesthetic, right? Is performance, right? Meaning a rock concert is a performance. It still has many functions. But we can also look at something as a performance. For example, my relationship with my best friend. That, if I look at my relationship as a performance, I can also start to apply those functions, okay? It helps me, it entertains me, right? This is someone who socially makes me feel great, right? This also helps me mark my identity because I align myself with people who believe in things that I believe in, right? It fosters a community. So my relationship with my best friend is housing all these functions. So to wrap this all up, right? Using the word as performance, right, is a tool so that we can look at things that are otherwise closed off to inquiry, right? As performance just is allowing us to study all the different aspects of hip-hop as a performance, okay? Is performance deals with more definite, bounded events marked by context, convention, usage, tradition, right? They can be aesthetic performance, music, theater, and dance. one way of ordering complex situations is to think about performances in terms of their functions, right? So we can think about, do they entertain? Do they heal? What are they doing? And there's different genres, right? There's different kinds of performances, right? In technology, in healing, in sex, right? There's all of these different things that the books talk about, right? Essentially, for our thinking, performances, we are stretching the idea of what a performance is so that our boundaries are indistinct, right? Play, games, sports, pop entertainment, performing arts, daily life, identity, ritual, right? This is all on a large continuum, right? It's all fair game. Everything is interlocking and relating, and that's how we can start to talk about why hip hop is most important. So chew on that a little bit. Hopefully that will allow you to complete the paper based on music genre. And we will get back to talking about Afrika Bambaataa and DJ Kool Herc, and start getting into this really fun idea of the dance hall and dance party culture that really started to shape and give birth to the four tenets of hip hop.